My dog has never turned down a treat in his life. He's a retired canine who survived the toughest streets in the city, so when our friendly neighbor offered him a biscuit, I expected a wagging tail. Instead, my dog did something that made the hair on my neck stand up. He turned his head away and stepped between us. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. He simply refused to let that man's hand get near me. It wasn't until I found what was hidden inside the neighbor's bag and the secret camera already running in my guest room that I realized my dog wasn't being picky. He was recognizing a face from a mission I thought we had finished years ago. If you've ever felt something was wrong, even when everyone else said it was harmless, stay with me. And if a dog has ever protected you by refusing instead of reacting, tell me in the comments. This is why people subscribe here. I'll recount this carefully the way it happened. The retired canine had been gentle since coming home. Older now, slower, happy with routine. He took treats softly, always waiting for permission, tail thumping against the floor like punctuation to a quiet life he'd earned. That afternoon was ordinary. The doorbell rang. A neighbor stepped inside with a smile and a paper bag folded at the top. The house smelled like coffee and rain. Nothing felt urgent. The neighbor crouched and held out a biscuit. "Hey, hero," he said lightly. "You earned this." The dog sniffed once, then turned his head away. No growl, no bark, just refusal. The handler frowned. "That's weird." The neighbor laughed. "Guess he's picky." The dog didn't move. He stared at the man's hands instead. And that was when the handler felt it too. The quiet certainty that this wasn't about the treat at all. The handler didn't say anything at first. He just watched the dog. Years ago, that look alone would have stopped a room. The stillness, the way the dog's body didn't tense, but set, like a lock clicking into place without noise. "You okay, buddy?" the handler asked quietly. The dog didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on the neighbor's hands. Not the treat, the hands. The neighbor chuckled again and straightened. "He's probably full. I'll just leave it here." He placed the biscuit on the coffee table. The dog stood, not abruptly, not aggressively. He rose and stepped forward once, just enough to put his body between the table and the handler. Block. The handler's pulse ticked up. He knew that posture. Had trusted it in places where trusting it meant staying alive. "Hey," he said gently. "You don't have to." The dog glanced back at him, then returned his gaze to the neighbor. The neighbor shifted his weight. "Man, he really doesn't like me, huh?" The dog's ears flicked at the movement. He didn't bark. That was worse. The handler forced a smile. "He's retired, still adjusting." The neighbor shrugged. "No worries. Guess I'll head out." He stepped toward the door. The dog moved too. One step, same distance, matching. The handler's throat tightened. "You don't have to leave." The neighbor waved it off. "Nah, I don't want to make him uncomfortable." The dog stopped when the neighbor stopped. Waited. The handler walked toward the kitchen, eyes never leaving the interaction. He reached the counter and casually pressed the panic button under the lip, an old habit he'd never unlearned. Silent. The neighbor turned back suddenly. "Forgot my bag." The dog moved instantly, placing himself between the neighbor and the hallway that led deeper into the house. Block. The handler's voice sharpened without him meaning it to. "I've got it." The neighbor smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's fine, I'll grab it." The dog growled, low, controlled, final. The room changed. The neighbor froze. "Whoa." The handler stepped forward now, body aligning with the dog's stance. "You're going to wait right there." The neighbor laughed nervously. "Okay, easy." The dog didn't relax. The handler picked up the paper bag. It was heavier than it should have been. Inside, under the biscuits, something hard pressed against the paper. The handler's stomach dropped. He looked up. "What's this?" The neighbor swallowed. "Just something I meant to give you later." The dog barked once, sharp. The handler set the bag down slowly and reached inside with 2 fingers. Metal, cold, a small folding knife. The neighbor's smile vanished. "Look, it's not." The dog lunged, not at the neighbor, at the door. He slammed his body against it, barking now, loud, insistent, then turned back and planted himself squarely in front of the handler, teeth bared. Protect. The handler backed up instinctively. Get down. The dog didn't. The neighbor took one step forward. The dog snapped the air, 1 inch from the man's leg. Enough. The handler's voice went cold. You're leaving. Now. The neighbor raised his hands. You're overreacting. The dog barked again, closer, deeper. The handler pointed to the door. Out! The neighbor backed away slowly, eyes darting. When he reached the threshold, he turned to run. The dog chased him to the door and stopped there, barking until the man disappeared down the steps. Only then did he turn back. Only then did he sit. The handler's legs gave out and he sank onto the couch, heart pounding. He stared at the knife on the table, then at the untouched treat beside it. You knew, he whispered. The dog walked over, sniffed the biscuit once more, and turned his head away again, still refusing. The house stayed quiet after the door slammed. Too quiet. The handler didn't move for a long moment. He sat with his hands flat on his thighs, forcing his breathing to slow, listening for anything that didn't belong. The dog stayed standing, between the handler and the front door. Not shaking, not pacing, watching. You okay? The handler asked softly. The dog didn't respond with a tail wag or a glance. He stared at the door like it might open again on its own. The handler leaned forward and picked up the knife with 2 fingers, careful not to cut himself. He set it on the counter, out of reach, then returned to the couch. That wasn't random, he said quietly. Was it? The dog finally turned his head and looked at him. Just once, then he stood and walked down the hallway, slow, deliberate, stopping at the spare room door. He sniffed the bottom of it. The handler's chest tightened. What are you smelling? The dog pawed once at the door, then twice, not scratching, indicating. The handler stood and opened it. Nothing looked disturbed. Guest bed made, closet closed, window locked. The dog moved inside and went straight to the corner near the dresser. He sniffed again, then sat. Alert. The handler crouched and pulled the dresser back. Underneath, taped to the wall, was a small black device. No lights, no markings. A camera. The handler's hands went cold. How long? The dog stood and barked once, sharp, and moved back into the hallway, then to the front door. He sniffed low along the baseboard, tracking. The handler followed. At the door, the dog stopped and stared at the handle. He's been here before, the handler whispered. The dog's tail stayed still. The handler unplugged the camera and set it on the counter beside the knife. He stared at both objects, realization settling in layers. The treats, the casual visit, the familiarity. Did you know him? The handler asked. The dog walked back to the couch and lay down, head up, eyes open. Waiting. The handler called the police. When officers arrived, the dog stood again and blocked the doorway until he recognized the uniforms. Only then did he step aside. Inside, the officers examined the items carefully. Camera's been here a while, one said. Battery's drained. Someone's been checking it. The handler nodded slowly. He didn't refuse the treat because it was poisoned. The officer looked at the dog. Why then? Because it came from him, the handler said. The dog sat beside him. The officers took statements and left with the evidence. The house felt exposed afterward, like something private had been seen without permission. The handler locked the doors and checked the windows again. He did it methodically, the way he'd been trained. The dog followed. Room to room, corner to corner. At the back door, the dog stopped and sniffed again. He barked once and nudged the lower frame with his nose. The handler crouched and examined it. Scratches, fresh. Good boy, he whispered. Thank you. The dog leaned briefly into his shoulder, then moved on. That night, the handler slept on the couch. The way he slept on the floor in front of the door. Every time the handler shifted, the dog's ears flicked. Every time a car passed outside, his head lifted. At one point, near dawn, the handler woke to a low growl. He froze. The dog stood, body tense, staring toward the window. Footsteps outside. They stopped. The dog barked, loud, explosive, and charged the window, slamming his weight into the sill. The footsteps ran. The handler sat up, heart racing. You scared him off. The dog returned and sat beside the couch. Finished. In the morning, the handler found fresh footprints in the wet grass near the fence line. One set, leaving. He stood there with the dog at his side, staring at the marks until the sun dried them away. You didn't react, he said softly. You recognized. The dog looked up at him. That was the difference. This wasn't about danger in the moment. It was about memory. The officer who came back the next afternoon didn't knock. He stood on the porch and waited. The dog noticed him first. Not with a bark, just a shift in posture. A rise from the rug, a steady walk to the door. He sat and looked up at the handler, permission. The handler opened the door. What did you find? The officer stepped inside, eyes scanning automatically. Your dog ever work narcotics? Yes, the handler said, and explosives. Before retirement. The officer nodded once. That man you described? He's not just a neighbor. The dog's ears tilted forward. He was flagged 3 years ago, the officer continued. Suspected courier. Slipped through every time. No hard evidence. The handler felt the weight of that settle. And the camera? Placed deliberately, the officer said. He was watching patterns, times, who came and went. The dog stood and moved closer to the handler's leg. The officer glanced down. Your dog recognized him because he's seen him before. The handler frowned. When? The officer hesitated. During a warehouse sweep outside the city, 2 years back. Your dog alerted on a vehicle. Man matched the description. The handler's breath caught. We never made the stop. No, the officer said, but your dog logged the scent. The dog's tail moved once, slow. The handler closed his eyes briefly. So the treat. The officer nodded. Same scent, different context. The dog hadn't refused food, he'd refused access. The officer placed photos on the table. Surveillance stills, grainy but unmistakable. Your dog didn't react because the man was threatening you in that moment, the officer said. He reacted because the man had already planned something. The handler stared at the images. What kind of something? The officer met his eyes. We believe he was waiting for you to leave town. The room felt smaller. He'd been mapping your routine, the officer continued. House empty, dog retired, easy. The dog growled softly, low and sustained. The handler rested a hand on his back. You stopped it before it started. The officer nodded. Yes. Later, after the officer left, the handler sat alone at the table, staring at the untouched biscuit still sitting where it had been placed. He picked it up and held it in his palm. Not poison, he murmured. Not bait. The dog watched him closely. You knew who held it, the handler said. You remembered. The dog stood and walked over, placing his nose against the handler's wrist, grounding. That night, the handler dreamed of old missions, of alerts ignored, of patterns missed. He woke to find the dog sitting upright, watching the window again. Not alarmed, just aware. In the morning, the handler made a decision. He packed a bag, not to leave, but to stay. He changed his routine, stayed home, let the house look occupied. Let the bank sit in the window. 2 days later, a patrol car idled across the street. The man never came back. The dog relaxed slowly over hours, not minutes. The handler finally understood what had saved him. The dog hadn't reacted to danger. He had recognized intent, and he had refused to let it cross the threshold. If you're still here, it's because you understand that the most important warnings aren't loud. If a dog has ever protected you by refusing instead of reacting, tell me in the comments and subscribe, because what comes next is where that refusal finally makes sense. The house felt different once the patrol car stopped coming. Not safer, just exposed. The handler noticed it in the quiet moments, the way every sound carried farther, the way the walls felt thinner now that he knew someone had been watching from the outside. He moved through the house more slowly, more deliberately. The dog stayed close, always within arm's reach. Not shadowing, not hovering, just present in the way only a partner could be. One evening, the handler sat at the kitchen table with the biscuit in front of him. He hadn't thrown it away. Not yet. He rolled it between his fingers, studying the crumbs left behind. You didn't even hesitate, he said softly. Not for a second. The dog lay on the floor at his feet, head resting on his paws, eyes open. You took treats from strangers all the time, the handler continued. Kids, neighbors, anyone who smelled safe. The dog lifted his head slightly. But you turned away from him. The dog stood and walked over, placing his nose gently against the handler's knee. That was his answer. The handler swallowed. You remembered a man from years ago, from one job. 1 cent. The dog leaned into him. Yes, that night the handler slept poorly. He woke at every sound, checked locks twice, looked out windows he'd never paid attention to before. The dog rose with him each time, mirroring his movements without impatience. Around 3 in the morning, the handler sat on the edge of the bed and put his face in his hands. I almost took that treat, he whispered. I almost laughed it off. The dog nudged his elbow. The handler looked down at him, eyes burning. You saved me without making a sound. The dog's tail thumped once. The handler reached down and rested his forehead against the dog's head, staying there longer than he meant to. I taught you to alert, he murmured, to bark, to charge. The dog stayed still. But you learned when not to. The weight of that pressed into the handler's chest until he had to breathe through it carefully. The next day he removed the spare key from under the flower pot and changed the locks. He moved the chair away from the window where the man's camera had once been hidden. He boxed up the old gear he thought he'd never need again. The dog watched every step. When the handler finished, he sat on the floor and leaned back against the couch. I thought retirement meant rest, he said quietly. For both of us. The dog walked over and sat in front of him, eyes calm, steady. The handler nodded slowly, but it just meant different work. He reached out and scratched behind the dog's ear, the familiar spot that made his eyes soften. You didn't attack him, the handler said. You didn't scare anyone. The dog's ears flicked. You refused him. That word lingered in the room. Refusal, not aggression, not fear, judgment. That evening, as the sun dropped low and painted the living room gold, the handler sat on the couch and watched the dog doze at his feet. For the first time since the incident, the tension in his shoulders eased. You chose the quiet way, he whispered. You always did. The dog sighed in his sleep. The handler closed his eyes too, and in that stillness, he finally let himself feel what almost happened, and what didn't. The house settled into a new rhythm after that, not the old one, a quieter, more deliberate version. The handler stopped moving through his days on autopilot. He noticed when the floorboards creaked, when a car idled too long outside, when the dog lifted his head for reasons that didn't announce themselves. The dog noticed everything else. Weeks passed without incident. The man didn't return. The camera never reappeared. The knife stayed locked in an evidence bag somewhere far from the house. But the moment stayed. One afternoon, the handler sat on the porch with a mug cooling in his hands. The dog lay beside him, chin resting on his paws, eyes half closed. The world moved past in ordinary ways. Mail truck, distant laughter, wind in the trees. A delivery driver approached with a package and a casual smile. The dog opened one eye. The handler felt it instantly and stood. I've got it. The driver paused. No problem. The dog watched until the man walked away. Only then did he relax again. The handler exhaled slowly and sat back down. You're still choosing, he murmured. The dog leaned against his leg. That night, the handler dreamed less. When he woke, the dog was still there, breathing steady, presence unwavering. The handler realized something then that took the breath from his chest. This wasn't about danger anymore. It was about trust. Trust built over years of listening to a dog who didn't waste signals, who didn't confuse noise for meaning, who knew when to escalate and when refusal was enough. One evening, the handler placed a fresh treat on the floor. The dog sniffed it, then ate it. The handler smiled faintly. Different hands. The dog's tail wagged once. They didn't talk about the incident anymore, not out loud. But sometimes, late at night, the handler would sit in the dark and replay that quiet moment in his mind. The head turning away. The refusal. How close he'd come to dismissing it. He knelt beside the dog one night and rested his hands on his shoulders. You didn't save me by being loud. he said quietly. You saved me by being certain. The dog met his gaze. Steady. That certainty held. Months later, the handler walked the dog past the park where kids played and neighbors waved. Life looked normal again from the outside, but the handler knew better now. Normal is what danger hides behind. They passed a man handing out flyers. The dog glanced once, then walked on. Clear. The handler felt a rush of gratitude he couldn't explain to anyone else. At home, he cleaned out the pantry and finally threw away the old biscuit. Not because it frightened him anymore, but because it reminded him how easy it is to miss the quiet moments that matter most. That evening, he cooked dinner and let the dog lie nearby, relaxed, content. Thank you, he said one last time, not expecting anything back. The dog lifted his head, ears soft, eyes kind. He rested his chin on the handler's knee. The choice had been made long ago, and it had held. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that the quiet refusals matter, subscribe so these moments don't go unheard. And tell me in the comments, would you have noticed when the dog turned away? He didn't bare his teeth or raise his voice. He simply refused, and that refusal saved a life.